Ahoy, ahoy! This is the True North Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Monkey Knife Fight. Very proud members of the Fantasy Points Media Group, fantasypoints.com. 21 True North 10, all caps. I'm Tyrell McLaughlin at TNFF Tyrell. At True North FFB is where the crew is at. At TNFF Pod is the account to turn all the notifications on for. Speaking of notifications, my plan of attack on this ditty is to go through some vacated volume and stuff, but it's a complicated process. Like, I'm going to do a lay of the land for all four of these teams from this division that we are coveting the players for fantasy football from all these teams. So I'm going to go through some of this available volume, aka vacated volume, aka the targets, the carries, the running back touches, the goal line work, the air yards, the market share, all the volume and production that's gone from last season. And I'm going to get into what we should expect going forward, ask who absorbed some of this work, and look at some of the crucial changes that we anticipate, explore some of the incoming skill players that'll enter that conversation, and try to get a grip on what is a pretty convoluted topic, but it is very important. I think it's kind of funny that you hear, available volume is noisy. It's just a noisy topic. And that is true, but what isn't in football? This is a volatile, turnover happy, copycat, small sample size sport. But for example, if I'm taking that side of the argument, it can be definitely irresponsible to just transfer one player's volume to another. Like, we aren't going to just give Nelson Aguilar's numbers with Derek Carr and the Raiders last year to Smokey John Brown, even though he will serve a very similar niche in that offense. And honestly, Smokey Brown might not be the best example there. I kind of like John Brown at cost this year. Another blanket statement, though, I think for vacated volume that's important is that we want to be more careful with volume that's available in the passing game compared to the running game. You hear the phrase in fantasy sometimes, somebody has to catch these passes. I don't really like that argument. I mean, it's obviously one that we're making usually because of how bad a player's team projects to be or the quarterback play. And on the other side of that coin, a football team does have to run the ball like a bare minimum of 300 times in a season. And there's far fewer running backs, obviously, right, than wide receivers on a team. So there's actually more truth, in my opinion, saying something like, somebody has to see these carries in an offense. And you think of Michael Carter or somebody who is like the Jets backfield that we're going to monitor during camp and have nothing to do with this episode. But even though, you hear the former more than the latter when it comes to the passing game and people desperate to distribute those targets that are available as opposed to the rushing work that is available over the offseason. But it's just one of the forces that at work that makes this topic kind of controversial. And the reasons to take vacated volume with a grain of salt, they're plentiful, right? There's incoming and outgoing players. There are injuries, like we obviously don't pay much mind to a team like the Giants or the Panthers raking among the league lead in available running back touches or whatever, because we know Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey return. But, to shed some light on the nuance, the context we have to apply all the time to available volume, like Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey render their team's available volume pretty useless in the run game, but those running backs actually do affect the volume that's available in those passing games, because Saquon, and even more so Christian McCaffrey, will undoubtedly command a significant portion of the targets in those passing games. So a team like Carolina, who lost Curtis Samuel, they might be more likely to see that volume that's left behind in their offense go to existing players like Christian McCaffrey or DJ Moore, and doesn't just get passed on to a wide receiver that they drafted, say Terrace Marshall, who, we really like Terrace Marshall, but that's just the way some of this stuff works. And to take that controversial, just to go a step further on that, like a Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley, they're going to come back. They're going to eat up a bunch of targets and catches. So you can take those away from the available volume and other players perhaps, but they won't inherit a ton of air yards, right? Which you can use for a lot of things when it comes to available air yards, whether it's reverse engineering expectations for an offense or tinkering with projections. But, if the offense calls for it, like a Buffalo or whatever, we can try and distribute those air yards to wherever or whomever we deem most likely to soak them up. So And that doesn't obviously have to be just one person. And we're going to get into a lot of that during these teams here. I plan on getting into most of this stuff. So I didn't want to do a long intro, and I won't going forward in this little mini series, but I am with people. Available volume is noisy because it's not the easiest thing to contextualize. Like that was just me giving a couple examples with player turnover and injuries. There's actually like other giant complexes at work. Like every year, the giant coaching and scheme changes that we see, the carousel every year, really keeps us on our toes with this stuff. And there's random variance in football. It's tough. The schedule changes so much from season to season, as does the performance of a collection of 50 plus men. And all of that, the coaching staffs, the quarterback play, it can skew the play volume, it can skew the pass rates, and that can skew a lot of the available volume. But what we can do is talk a lot about all of that stuff, apply the context to these teams, no matter how much we have to, because it'll give us some good clarity, because I like available volume. It gives us tons of nuggets, and it's stuff you can't see on tape, obviously, or like you think of a team like the Lions, who have just so many bloody targets and catches and just everything up for grabs, rushing work as well, with the loss of Kenny Goaway and Danny Amendola, Marvin Jones, and others. But you think about their two best skill players arguably still being there, so no matter how bad a team might be, like a team in Motor City this season, the available volume makes players like TJ Hawkinson, like DeAndre Swift, pretty impossible to ignore. But before I got into things, I did want to acknowledge that this stuff can be a pretty polarizing topic that demands people to take a much more granular approach because of, all that stuff that we kind of got into, and we're going to get into with these teams. So why don't we get into it? And by we, I guess I should say, that is the universal we. I am free solo on this trek. Trav and I will be back again next Thursday. We just had the pleasure of interviewing Jeff Lambert on the most recent episode of the True North Fantasy Football podcast. And I look forward to next week as well. So I am in the Pacific Northwest up here, so I figured I would start in Pacific time in the NFC West, one of the stronger divisions probably in all of football, and teams that we want to be attached to for fantasy. And I'm going to talk a lot of player values too. Like, that's why I didn't want this thing to be available volume, you know what I mean? Because it is going to be, I'm going to slant this whole shebang towards fantasy, of course. But I'm done stalling. So who do I have? I have Arizona off the top here. That is correct. I'm going to trek through the desert alone here off the top. So I think Arizona is actually a great team to dive into for available volume. I almost forgot, actually, very important. I will put the links in the description for the data and stuff that I used during this episode. I used NBC Sports, the company formerly known as Roto World, for this vacated volume. I've always used them for this resource. It's more that I know John Daigle does this at Roto World, and he's the analyst putting this all together. So I trust him. I respect him. And I just enjoyed him actually not too long ago on the Goat District podcast. Make sure you are #alwaysbetrading and subscribing to the Goat District podcast. And what I do with vacated volume every year, or what I do with whatever I want from wherever I want, I put it into spreadsheets, and so I can sort, compare, combine, archive, all that stuff. And I will link to that as well in case anybody would like a copy of like available volume done up as a little mini database. The Arizona Cardinals, they do have a lot of volume up for grabs. Sorry, thirsty, disoriented in the desert already. And we're going to distribute these targets, I think. A big draw for fantasy, the community, when they hired Cliff Kingsbury a couple of years ago, was how fast he was going to make this Arizona offense, right? The pace of play and the upside of a pass-heavy unit in this spread-out offense. And in the 2 seasons now under his tutelage, the Cardinals' play volume went up about 100 plays in 2019, and in 2020, they ran about 80 more plays than they ran in 2019. And there is even more room for these this family of cacti to grow, right? We see the relationship between play volume in Arizona has played out pretty clearly in the 2 seasons with Kingsbury too. To avoid going down that rabbit hole, I'll just say that it has a lot to do with team defense and and time of a possession, of course. And they still have waves they can make in terms of improving on both those fronts. And a good place to start to improve on those fronts would be third down efficiency on both sides of the ball, I think. But sticking to fantasy here, the numbers are there. Like, we are just waiting for this team to explode and enter elite territory in terms of play volume, which we know everything trickles down from, right? And it's a pretty important thing to be aware of when talking about available volume. So even before we've really started, we get pretty excited about this offense and thinking about the volume maybe going up. And that is supposed to drive down efficiency, right? Volume goes up, efficiency is usually going to come down. But in Arizona, we've really seen the opposite here. And I think there's room for that to as well go up. Even though the play volume has gone up exponentially for back-to-back seasons, so too has the efficiency. And I'm not giving them a ton of credit here for being, better than they were before Cliff and Kyler came to town. Like, I can't remember. The head coach is driving me nuts right now, but the Cardinals were inarguably the least efficient team in recent memory in that 2018 season. They averaged 4.3 yards per play, which is the worst among any team in the last half decade. But they 180'd with Kingsbury, 5.5 yards per play in the Double K's rookie years, and even with a big year of tape for defenses to view and observe and study, and a big jump in play volume last year. Arizona actually went from 5.5 yards per play to 5.7 yards per play. So an improvement, and I think they still have a little bit. Steve Wilks, that's his name, Steve Wilks. What an inanimate object. But Kingsbury and Kyler definitely just, elevated this offense immediately when they came in. And the increase in play volume, in efficiency, check this out. It literally led to more than double the yards on offense. And in 2020, Arizona put up over 6,000 yards on offense compared to the 2,288 the season before Kyler and Cliff came into the fold. And so, what I'm trying to convey here, what I'm getting at is this is a really unique offense. And there's a quarterback here who has one of the most unique skill sets we've ever really seen at the position. And that's led to Arizona being a borderline powerhouse offense at times. We saw that last year come to the forefront. And I think there's still a little bit of upside to chase going forward for them to really take that next step into elite offensive territory. And I think about, that Nuk Hopkins addition as well. That definitely put them over the top last year, kind of slotted all their weapons in the passing game into their correct roles, so to speak. And some of the improvement and some of that sustained efficiency in 2020 was definitely in large part to Nuk, not just his production, which was instantaneous and excellent, but, his presence was big, I thought, as that alpha in this offense. And like I'm saying, there's room for this whole offense to continue to grow, as that was just Nuk Hopkins' first year. Moving on here, though, the passing game isn't really, isn't the only thing that reignited in Arizona with these guys. We've also seen with Kyler at quarterback in this Kingsbury scheme, benefits and advantages that have extended to the run game as well. And the running backs, the Cardinals are averaging 4.8 yards per carry over the last 2 years. That is pretty elite territory. And this offense, it does build in some efficiency. Like, running backs will see very light boxes because of how spread out, the scheme is, the RPO action, the fact teams need to spy Kai all the time. And that leads to well above average yards before contact per attempt for the running backs. Unfortunately, in my opinion, getting into this backfield highlighted by Chase Edmonds and new addition James Conner, there's not a lot of yards after contact to speak of. I think that would be what stands out to me, which is my way of kind of easing into a suggestion that maybe the running back position in this situation has been a tad overrated. From, the classic 30,000 foot view, it definitely appears that way. Like, Arizona's running backs have combined to finish outside the top 15 in carries, rushing yards, touchdowns, running back receptions, and receiving yards last year. And, it's tough because we've seen some of the advantages that exist in this offense. And we've seen Kenyon Drake, even David Johnson perform like legit RB1s as Kingsbury's lead back. But again, if for no other reason than because I thought it was sobering, like, the Cardinals have finished 14th and 17th now in fantasy points scored by running backs in the 2 seasons under Cliff and Kyler. And now with camp starting up soon, I hate to say it, but like the Cardinals running back room is pretty thin, like one of the worst on paper in the league. And it's pretty fragile, isn't it? Like, I don't know. But, Arizona is among the teams with the most volume available at the running back position. Almost half of Arizona's carries from last season are gone, almost 240 total carries from 2020. And about 270 running back touches left this offseason with the Drake. That's the fifth most up for grabs in any offense. And we could even continue to see the play volume increase, right? So this might even be a little bit understated. Another reminder, actually, for vacated volume, especially in this day and age, is an extra applicable in this offense, and it'll kind of work me into my next point anyways, is we have to remember the quarterback's share of the rushing work, right? And last year, Kyler Murray accounted for almost 30% of the Cardinals' carries. And man alive, did quarterbacks ever smash the all-time record for rushing touchdowns in 2020? It was just incredible. And Kyler was a big part of that. I wrote an article actually called the the buffet of positive regression last year, and we talked about Kyler and how much work he commanded at the goal line in his rookie season. Not saying I called Kyler scoring 11 times, but I'm saying he has a really big role in the run game, and that extends to the goal line. So that might be where people are worried about the touchdown regression, but there was a ton of red zone carries up for grabs. And Kyler scored more last season. There's no doubt about it. But the running backs were just really bad at the goal line in 2020, despite a ton of volume. They were just much worse than 2019, despite seeing much more volume. It was really trippy. According to sharpfootballstats.com, last year, the Cardinals running backs scored 9 touchdowns on 71 red zone carries. 71 red zone carries by the running backs was 30 more than the season before. But in 2019, Cardinals running backs scored more touchdowns in the red zone, even though they saw less than 60% as many carries in the red zone. And at the same time, right, Kyler Murray was scoring at will in this area of the field after next to no luck in the red zone as a rookie. And if we zoom in even further really quickly, because this is the way James Conner pays off his ADP, in my opinion, because the goal line carries are even more pronounced. The Drake leaves 21 goal line carries behind, and that was one shy of the league leaders, Dalvin Cook and Ezekiel Elliott. So almost needless to say that 21 goal line carries is by far the most available among all 32 teams, giving James Conner like some consideration in fantasy, especially at cost, and an avenue for Kyler Murray, like I said, to combat or quell any concerns for a big step back in the rushing touchdown column, right? And sort of sidebar, I hinted there's still multiple areas for Arizona to improve. And also about that regression article from last year, the red zone efficiency was a big thing to point to. 29th in touchdown red zone rate 2 seasons ago, 8th best last year. And I put a study thing out about teams who score on under 50% of their red zone trips in a season experience a bounce back of over 10% on average the following season, which is just a good thing to know. But the Cardinals scored a touchdown in the red zone about 20% more often in 2020 versus 2019. And going forward, even if we are, scared that red zone touchdown rate meets somewhere in the middle, Arizona still has a lot of room. If they increase the play volume, the efficiency on third down and stuff, they will have more red zone trips. So to get off the run game here, James Conner, I think, is sort of enticing because he's so cheap, obviously a 0 RB candidate. And frankly, it's in a way because of the vacated volume, to be honest, in this offense. I don't think multiple running backs will produce in this offense, though. And there's no question that I prefer Chase Edmonds between the two, particularly in a PPR league, of course, but he is several rounds more expensive in the majority of drafts that I've participated in. But I like Chase Edmonds. He is a very talented guy who's going to see some juicy work, maybe some work in the red zone. And I just think he's always come with that mystery box upside, even since going back to college, right? But with the defined roles, I think there's a chance the answer to what running back should we draft in Arizona is neither. I think like James Conner is going to be pretty touchdown dependent for spike weeks, whereas the spiked weeks could be kind of hard to come by for Chase Edmonds so long as James Conner is healthy. But his pass catching upside makes him just a way safer option, and the back you'll feel most comfortable starting on a weekly basis from this backfield. I also think his upside, should James Conner go down, is pretty big, right? Like, I think if one of these running backs goes down, the other is very valuable. That's for sure. We like to think, though, that these running backs can't handle a bigger workload, but we actually saw Kingsbury was fine to hand the reins to Chase Edmonds last year when Drake missed. So we hit on James Conner. The other new faces in this passing game, in this offense, they're in the wide receiver room. So the Cardinals added a pretty sexy little explosive wide receiver in Rondale Moore, I think he can operate multiple ways. I envision him as a vertical slot wide receiver meets quick slant zero route guy, yak guy. Not unlike James Conner, though. I'm telling you, like, Rondale Moore's biggest concern is that he has a scary injury history. The other name, I guess, would be AJ Green, right? That's AJ Green might be the reason that N'Keal Harry isn't going back home. If he was to get traded from the Patriots, I don't think the Cardinals are in play. I don't really want to talk about AJ Green because I don't think he's very fantasy relevant, but I'll say two quick things. Number one, AJ Green is one of my favorite players. Number two, AJ Green probably had the worst statistical season in 2020 of any wide receiver with 100 targets in the past decade at least. There's some blame to spread around there, be it Joe Burrow's on target rate and deep passing woes, or Zach Taylor in Cincinnati. But the point for me is that I'm not sure they're sending AJ Green on any go routes or anything. Like, maybe he does some Larry Fitzgerald things, maybe some tight end things, since that position doesn't really exist in Arizona. But I don't know what AJ Green is going to do outside of serving a role in the end zone. And I know they do. They have a lot of wide receivers on the field in Arizona. I grant you that. But I think a lot of this is kind of hard to say pre-camp. Something we'll monitor with the ones during Cardinals in preseason. But the best case for AJ Green, I think, is like a volatile or touchdown dependent wide receiver who comes with a really low floor. I think he had 5 goose eggs last year, even though he had 100 targets. But I admit he got more money than I expected, and compared to the market. And the Cardinals they're pretty thin when it comes to wide receivers who can play on the perimeter. And who knows? Maybe AJ Green goes full Larry Fitzgerald mode. Maybe he's the big slot. Who knows? I think he's more likely to be tight end mode. But on the other end of the spectrum, to AJ Green in this offense, Nuk Hopkins. He's going to see 25 to 30% of the team's targets. And he could have an even better season this year in his second season under Cliff and Kyler than he had last year. And in the middle, we have Christian Kirk, Rondale Moore, Andy Isabella, and Keyshawn Johnson, I would say, belongs in that conversation. Christian Kirk, though, he enters 2021. He's a tough one, man. He enters this season on the final year of his rookie contract, right? And he was used much differently in 2020 than he had been earlier in his career. The average depth of target, the air yards just completely skyrocketed. But does that role really suit him, right? And then with Larry Fitzgerald's retirement, does Kirk kick back inside more often than not? I think so, but I think that should happen, you know what I mean? But the reason I'm not sold necessarily that happens is because Rondale Moore, even Andy Isabella, these guys are best suited to play in the slot as well. I just want to say that behind Nuk Hopkins, the market share is kind of murky, right? Number 2 in the pecking order could be the running back position. That would be my bet, like making Chase Edmonds ADP even a bit more sensible. Even if somebody like, Benjamin or James Conner cuts in a little bit. But I really think the running backs are probably number 2 in the passing game in Arizona. And I think that is really what's driving Chase Edmonds ADP. If it isn't the running backs, it's definitely Christian Kirk, though, I think, which could constitute him as a value in fantasy football in almost all formats right now. Then you have Rondale Moore, right, who is super electric, super exciting. I'm assuming Cliff Kingsbury will manufacture some touches for him right away. And he's not really a volume guy anyways, right? Like, can he handle playing 60% of the snaps? I'm not sure. Can he handle catching passes, quick passes over the middle, going over the middle? I don't know. So a lot is still up in the air here, if you ask me. And, adding to my confusion with Rondale, the landing spot, it seemed like Arizona really wanted to add a vertical slot element to the offense. Kingsbury is like that going back to Texas Tech. That's why I use Kiki Kuti. And that's how we saw Andy Isabella used last year. So, is that the role they envision for Rondale? Can he serve multiple niches? Because if not, he's going to be very volatile. That's what I worry about. So I hate admitting when I don't know, but it's because I have a hard time finding value here in this passing game at ADP. I think the value might actually be Nuk Hopkins in like the second round, right? And on top of the ambiguous target share, there's a decent chunk of volume to distribute from last year, despite the core from this team pretty much staying intact in Arizona. So I will just get out of the desert here by dishing this vacated volume in the passing game for the Cardinals. Almost 30% of their market share from last season is gone, about 1/4 of their air yards. Another area the Cardinals could continue to grow, I think, is in the deep passing arena as well. So the over 1,000 air yards that are already available could be another underrepresentation even. And, another thing is that most of their vacated targets, or at least a good chunk of them, are Dan Arnold tight end targets, which doesn't sound like much. I think it's just like 45 tight end targets, but it is top 10 in vacated tight end targets. And it is, the majority of their tight end market share from a season ago because that position was so devalued. So, it's looking like we could literally see under 10% of the targets go to the tight end position in Arizona in 2021, which is pretty crazy. So maybe like some of it will go back to the tight end position. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Cardinals wide receivers led the NFL in targets, in market share, in receptions. In other words, the Cardinals are a good bet to split the largest PPR pie of any wide receiver room in all of football. But at the same time, I think a lot of the tight end market share is going to be like 10 to 15% max. And then how much higher can it go at the wide receiver position when it comes to 65 to 75%? You're not getting higher than 70, 75%. So there is room for the running backs to see a good chunk of the market share in Arizona, but the wide receivers will dominate the market share. There's no questions there. Speaking of which, let's go to the Los Angeles Rams. They are a squad I actually have a couple videos planned for in the works, so centered around the passing game as well, because there is a lot of similar works at play. High volume offense, right? High play volume in Los Angeles and heavy wide receiver market share. And there is also sneaky available volume here, despite the main cohorts still in their roles, like Cooper Kupp, Tyler Higbee, and Bobby Woods, right? So the big takeaway for the Rams for me is definitely Robert Woods, to a lesser extent Cooper Kupp, maybe Tyler Higbee, because the Rams saw some high leverage work leave during the offseason, and they've really only brought in Deshaun Jackson and Tutu Atwell. That's pretty much all they added, right? And I'm bearing the lead here. If you can't tell, like the Rams did make one big offseason acquisition, and that's sending Goff to the Lions along with some future first round picks in exchange for Matthew Stafford. So I don't think Matthew Stafford turns the offense in LA on its head, but no doubt he elevates the ceiling in fantasy for guys like Robert Woods for the entire passing game. The air yards, the end zone targets, the most valuable types of targets are all set to possibly explode for the Rams wide receivers. And I tweeted out a little while ago that over the last 2 seasons, according to RotoViz, there's only 2 wide receivers that have 1,000 total yards after the catch, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, 2 Rams wide receivers. And somebody asked about if they can sustain that with an increase in average depth of target and all that. And I say yes. And any decline will be compensated via air yards, especially in Robert Woods' case. But I think Bobby, and actually, maybe I'll go there first. I think Robert Woods is the best suited to accommodate the added vertical element to the passing game we hope Stafford is injecting, right? Whereas Deshaun Jackson is more of a complementary piece at this stage of his career, regardless of the McVay connection. Tutu Atwell, on the other hand, operated as like a vertical slot wide receiver in college, but in the pros, I think he'll be more of a pre-snap motion machine. When he's on the field, I think he'll likely see a lot of screen passes, right? And like he's going to see more screen passes than deep balls. I think a big chunk of his catches in college were screen passes as well for Tutu Atwell. And guess what? That is super good news for Robert Woods. Why? Because last year, Well, actually, let's do it this way. Why do we not want our guys seeing screen passes? Because they're some of the lowest value touches a fantasy player can see, right? And over 20% of Robert Woods' catches last season came on screen passes. Bobby Woods led the NFL in targets and receptions off screen passes, and I'm suggesting he has the skill set best suited to consistently hang with Stafford's arm talent. So I think he is a huge winner here. And if Tutu Atwell was to take some of that work, in theory, like based on the tendencies and upside that now exist in this offense with Stafford, the roles the wide receivers will play, Woods could see a significant chunk of those screen passes just straight up converted into deep targets via pff.com, which is where I grab screen passes, where I grab deep ball targets, which is 20 plus yards downfield. And volume, it would just be awesome going from some of the least valuable targets that you could possibly see to the most valuable targets you could possibly see. Well, being a top 15 wide receiver for the last 3 seasons straight, which is what Robert Woods has been. And, maybe sidebar here, we should expect the Rams to go back to a lot more 3 wide receiver sets after, the 2 tight end experiment has pretty much failed, especially when it comes to offensive efficiency while playing in 12 personnel. And the Rams let tight ends walk without really replacing them this offseason. And I just can't stress enough, getting back to the point that I was trying to make off the top there, that an increase in average depth of target, in air yards, in deep targets, it doesn't have to come at the expense of yards after the catch for the Rams offense, which is why we should feel comfortable drafting Cooper Kupp. It's why I'm running to the podium to select Robert Woods in my fantasy drafts. And it's like we forgot that Jared Goff was actually pretty good. Like, he didn't suck in 2018. The roadmap is kind of in place. We saw the ceiling from this offense, but a few years ago when the Rams put up 6,738 yards on offense, the 12th most in NFL history. And if you pull up the team advanced stats page on Pro Football Reference, I want to look at their air yards versus their yards after the catch. So last year, actually, let's start in 2018. We saw both. They were 8th in air yards and 4th in team yards after the catch. 2019, they went to 13th in air yards, but they were 1st in yards after the catch. Last season, still 4th in yards after the catch with Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, you're always going to be, but 28th in air yards last season. So I'm telling you, they can be top 10 in both. I almost expect them to be in both departments, air yards and yards after the catch, with the transition of Goff to Stafford. And speaking of top 10, getting to the meat here, the Rams ranked top 10 in available targets and air yards. About 1/3 of their targets from last season are gone. Same with the Rams air yards. And just like in Arizona, even though some of those targets are tight end targets, some of them could be converted into wide receiver targets. And the Rams could just throw the ball a little bit more with Stafford coming in, right? Some losses on the defensive end of the ball, I think, are being a bit overstated, including their defensive coordinator who took the head coaching job in San Diego, or in the other LA. That's trippy. Yeah, so he didn't even have to move. Good for him. But the point here, guys, with the Rams is we are building whatever we talk about on top of what already existed for 4 years straight, basically, under McVay. We say volume is king, and the Rams are an absolute wide receiver funnel of a passing game. Over the last 4 years combined, so in the McVay era, the Rams have thrown 65% of their passes to the wide receiver position. Only the Falcons' wide receiver market share is higher than the Rams over that span, just 1% higher. In all 4 seasons under McVay, the Rams wide receivers have ranked 8th or higher in catches every year. So that's a pretty incredible floor, especially from a PPR perspective, but we haven't really seen the ceiling over the last couple of years, and the production kind of fell off the upper deck in 2020. Rams wideouts were top 10 in receiving yards all 3 seasons, 2017, 2018, 2019, fell to 13th last year. So the Stafford edition, if nothing else, I think it also shakes up this offense, which is much needed. Just the engine has stalled in this passing game, because getting into the rest of this available volume, we've been annoyed by the touchdowns in particular in the last couple of years. And I know I kind of blew by the air yards there, but there's a good chunk of air yards up for grabs, like I said. Early in the season, maybe just to touch on, maybe Deshaun Jackson could take some of those air yards early in the season, but I expect Robert Woods to lead this team by a wide margin in 2021 when it comes to air yards and deep targets. But what I want to talk about is the targets available inside the 10-yard line, getting to those touchdowns. The Rams ranked 15th, or they rank 15th with 7 targets available inside the 10-yard line from last season, but they ranked 12th in 10-zone market share available. And when I talk about the Rams running backs in a second, I'll get into why the market share in the red zone could be much more important to look at than available targets when it comes to the Rams. And spoiler alert, it's about the rush to pass ratio in the red zone during the Goff era. But yeah, the touchdowns have been what's really volatile. You know what I mean? Like the Rams wide receivers have 27 touchdowns over the last 2 seasons after scoring 41 times during the previous 2 seasons combined. So imagine where a guy like Bobby Woods would be if he'd been scoring, you know what I mean? Like the guy's the wide receiver 12 in PPR over the last 2 seasons there, when 43 wide receivers have more receiving touchdowns than him over the last 2 years. I mean, it's crazy. I think Tyler Higbee as well will be another big beneficiary if they curve the rush to pass ratio inside the 10-yard line. And we should also throw Cooper Kupp into that mix. I know Woods has actually been better at converting end zone touchdowns, and Kupp also loses his blonde BFF connection with Goff, but an increase in touchdowns will do a lot for Cooper Kupp as well, who has had success in that area of the field in the past. But there's another big complex here that I think lends to Robert Woods' upside. The Rams have quietly scored a shitload of their touchdowns from inside the red zone. I mean, like most teams do, but nobody has done it more than the Goff McVay LA Rams. Don't believe me? Here's a stat here. 15 teams over the last 4 seasons have scored 83% or more of their offensive red zone. 83% or more of their touchdowns on offense inside their opponent's red zone. No team shows up on that list of 15 teams over the last 4 seasons more than twice, except the Rams, who have done it all 4 seasons under McVay and Goff, scored 83% or more of their offensive touchdowns inside the red zone. That represents more than like 1/4 of the team since 2017 who has needed to score that many of their touchdowns inside the red zone. It's just crazy. So we should 100%, we're going to see more touchdowns from outside the red zone, be it off play action, off deep passing, both. But what this lets us do is start to imagine what this offense can do for these 2 wide receivers. If the air yards increases and the touchdowns go up, right? We start to paint a pretty picture, right? It's kind of incredible because the Rams might already be arguably the best situation for a wide receiver, at least in PPR. Per Pro Football Reference, the Rams are the only team to produce multiple 200 plus PPR wide receivers in back-to-back-to-back seasons. And fun fact, the only team to do it in 2017 was Matthew Stafford's Detroit Lions. So, to call, I just think the Rams are in a rut, right? And I think the team and the wide receivers will just bounce back and get this major shot in the arm, which is great news for a wide receiver corps that combined to score the 4th most PPR points in 2017, 2018, and 2019 before dipping to the 12th most fantasy points scored by wide receivers in 2020. I mean, under McVay, the Rams have scored in the top 5 for total wide receiver fantasy points in 3 of 4 seasons. That is just insane. We want wide receivers from this offense. So yeah, I guess, I want to move on to the run game. It might be more interesting to me because I guess I'm pretty steadfast in saying that the wide receivers can enjoy some deep passing work, some play action bombs, and maintain, some of that elite yards after the catch while they're at it. What I have less conviction in is that the run game can continue to hum as a well-oiled machine or an elite oiled machine. Alongside all that upside in the passing game. I'm not sure if that can both happen, you know what I mean? And if some of my prognostications come to fruition, it's going to be bad news for Cam Akers, for example, like the Rams scoring more from outside the red zone or the pass rate when they do get into the red zone increasing would not be good news for Cam Akers. With that being said, I mean, the Rams, they play in one of the tougher divisions in football. Like I said, they have an elite defense, and McVay, executes an immaculate outside zone scheme that don't look now, but half the league is running some variation of heading into 2021. And, it took some time for Akers to get the reins last season. But if you look at it, the Rams actually have a ton of available volume in the run game as well. The Rams rank top 10 in vacated running back touches, 8th in carries, just 33 running back targets up for grabs. But, Goff and the Rams actually had a really low running back market share over the last 2 straight seasons. And I don't even think the Rams running backs have a ceiling much higher than, say, 15, 16, 17% of the team's total targets. But an increase in running back market share, it could come from that vacated tight end target total that I was referring to, because, about 65% of the targets in this offense as well will go to the wide receiver position, right? And that only leaves 35% of the targets, but this is another offense that maybe Tyler Higbee is being a bit overdrafted. I really like Tyler Higbee, but, he's going to be a touchdown or bust guy because there's not a lot of room to split between the running backs and tight ends when your offense is shoveling 65+% of the targets to the wide receiver position, right? And the pass catching is probably my biggest fear with Cam Akers, who will cost you a first-round fantasy pick in almost every draft in all formats, right? The last thing I wanted to touch on is something I've already hinted on, but the goal line work, right? Because Malcolm Brown going to Miami, Will Smith style, puts the Rams in the top 5 in goal line carries available. They have 13 carries inside the 5-yard line up for grabs, over 40% of the Rams carries from inside the 5-yard line last year, in theory. But I wasn't really being hyperbolic when I talked about the Rams being one of the run heaviest teams inside the red zone. The Rams have ranked top 10 in red zone pass rate. Sorry, they've ranked bottom 10 in red zone pass rate every season under Sean McVay and Goff. They've run the ball in the red zone more than passed in 4 straight seasons. So the Rams pass rate has gone down in every season. 50%, 48%, 47%. And last year, the Rams passed just 40% of the time inside the red zone, according to sharpfootballstats.com. Only Cam and the Patriots ran the ball more than Goff and the Rams in the red zone in 2020. Over the last 4 years, by the way, Stafford's Detroit Lions have never dipped below 53%. They've averaged a 57% pass rate in the red zone since 2017. And if you look at 2016, Cousins and Sean McVay in Washington, they also threw the ball 57% of the time in the red zone. So I don't know what else to say other than I can't really stomach Cam Akers at his cost because the running back market share seems capped and the touchdown upside for the running back position might not be what we once knew it to be in this Rams offense, even if they return to form. And with these tough questions I'm asking, there's just no way I can take Akers as early as he's going with some of the names around him. I'm not saying he has to be an outlier to be an RB1, but I do think he's being drafted pretty close to his ceiling and on the back of some advantages that might not even be there going forward. Matthew Stafford is a quarterback that I'm drafting a lot of because I think he can be an outlier, so to speak, when I think of, the importance that we've all of a sudden had to place on the rushing at the quarterback position, not all of a sudden, but the super emphasis we're all of a sudden placing on rushing at the quarterback position. Stafford isn't my top choice at the quarterback position, but if I miss out on quarterbacks that I'm targeting, Stafford, Brady, those are good guys. And what I love doing is pairing them with a Trey Lance or Justin Fields. I feel like those are almost the ideal quarterback builds if I miss out on the Kyler Murrays, the Lamar Jacksons. And I think I made my stance on Robert Woods very clear. He's been a top 15 wide receiver 3 straight seasons. I expect much of the same and some ceiling that I don't think he's getting credit for when I look at his average draft position in fantasy leagues. I'm also drafting Cooper Kupp at cost. Sue me. D-Jax in round 20. Why not? Especially in a best ball league, maybe it gives you 3 or 4 spiked weeks on a best ball team as your wide receiver 8. Why not? Tyler Higbee is somebody I'm interested in at his ADP. One of the last tight ends I might be comfortable with as my tight end 1, even though that says more about the tight end landscape than it does Tyler Higbee. But the Rams throwing more in close would be good for Tyler Higbee. The best part about this passing game, by the way, guys, is you can stack this whole group and you don't even have to spend a top 3 round pick in a fantasy draft to do it. Actually, before we quick hit, I'm going to go a lot quicker on the 49ers and we'll talk some Seahawks. I wouldn't mind taking this opportunity, though, to pause and thank our wonderful sponsors, fantasypoints.com. Surrounding yourself with the best, getting the most actionable information, access to some of the most accurate rankers in the industry. Those are just a few pieces of the process that we hold most dear and we want to have in our fantasy football arsenal on a yearly basis. And there's nowhere that guarantees, quality like fantasypoints.com when it comes to that kind of stuff. John Hansen is one of the GOATs of the industry. Joe Dolan is one of the most accurate rankers, a human trade calculator, if you will. Graham Barfield and Scott Barrett are analytical heroes. Tom Brawley is an absolute sponge and an elite betting expert. Ben Kukanis is the logistical genius. All of those great names I just named have a couple things in common. They are inarguably among the top of their field in the fantasy football world, but they're also all co-owners of fantasypoints.com. So I just think that is the coolest thing because we don't have to follow them around. And if we want to be surrounded by the best, we just have to go to fantasypoints.com and know that we can stay there forever. And if you do decide to do so, I really encourage you to use our promo code 21TrueNorth10. That's True North all caps. 21TrueNorth10 gets you 10% off what is already an incredible value. I dare you, shop around for real. I can only scratch the surface in these little spiels, but I hope people appreciate that I am always in process mode, trying to articulate how to fish, not just talk about fish. You know what I mean? And that's why it was so cool to get connected with fantasypoints.com, because if I were a fantasy football critic, a job I think I would excel at. But fantasypoints.com would be a 5-star outlet in all facets of the game. Moving into the 49ers, I will move with speed. I think I'm coming down with a cold or something. That is not good news. But if you want a more comprehensive breakdown of this squad, or, we actually, when we interviewed Jeff Lambert, he's a huge 49ers fan, very much in the know. So I put some of my takes to the test with him. And I encourage everybody to go listen to episode 96 of the True North Fantasy Football podcast in the feed. So if you guys have been following my work this offseason, you know how high I am on this offense in general. I've been pounding the table for Trey Sermon, Brendan Ayuk, and Trey Lance. So Trav and I definitely took advantage of having Jeff on. I was really happy to do that. But there's also a lot of available volume here. There's just so many advantages that I can't get into on this one. Couldn't even get into on that one. But follow our work because we really put a lot of it together with the 49ers. It's a team I feel like we're going to be talking a lot about. They saw some bodies go out the door during the offseason. Names like Tevin Coleman, who's running his extortion gambit in New York now. Jerick McKinnon left some juicy work up for grabs in the running back room. Kendrick Bourne from the wide receiver corps. Do they replace him with N'Keal Harry? We wait and see. Everything went wrong last year, though, right? In San Francisco, after 2019 was kind of a total Cinderella story. So it's a trippy complex that's at play here. Last year, they were just ravaged by injuries, COVID breakout, and their quarterback play was just a roller coaster of guys and talent, which I'm sure was very frustrating for the 49ers front office, who basically passed on Tom Brady, probably in large part due to what Jimmy G gave them in 2019, right? But a lot of that has changed over the offseason, and the offensive turnover is kind of highlighted by two big names selected by the 49ers in the draft, and they both have the same name, actually. Trey Sermon, who Shanahan and Lynch invested more on than any other running back in San Francisco's tenure there with Lynch and Shanahan, and Trey Lance, who the team showed incredible confidence in by trading up and spending the assets to do so. And just hearing some of the comments made by the staff and even the 49ers owner kind of making us think that we could see Trey Lance right away in week one. And that's the question we want answered at this stage, especially when we talk about available volume. I mean, I actually do full sets of projections for teams, assuming Jimmy G is the quarterback, assuming Trey Lance is the quarterback, and then I'm just going to prorate it depending on what I think happens at the quarterback position, or to roll out when Sir Lancelot does replace Jimmy Garoppolo, or at least so I have a baseline of expectations for the weapons, or vice versa, you know what I mean? So when we talk about available volume, available air yards, rushing market share in this offense, we need to know if it's Lance or Garoppolo. And let me make an argument for Lance. First off, week 6 is the 49ers bye, the earliest in all of football. You have to think that even if Jimmy G starts, I think he'd have to be 4-1 or 5-0 for them not to decide to make that transition, because the only reason that they might be a little bit hesitant, I would imagine, isn't because he's raw. It's because this is a very difficult playbook that Shanahan's scheme, puts out to their players. But I think with the Zoom meetings, one of the cool components of the COVID draft thingy, the fact they selected Trey Lance, we have to think Lance was picking up the play is pretty good. Second of all, the 49ers have inarguably the easiest strength of schedule in all of football. I don't care what outlet you look at. I don't care what metric you use to calculate strength of schedule, Vegas win totals, whatever. They have the easiest strength of schedule in all of football. That extends to the playoffs, by the way. So I just think even if he does have to wait till that week 6 bye, like, this is their strength of schedule for the fantasy football playoffs. Week 14, Cincinnati. Week 15, Atlanta with shootout potential. Week 16, Tennessee, whose defense has never been anything but putrid under Vrabel. Houston, week 17, fantasy championship week. And why not? Why not start Trey Lance right away? It's a way to keep Jimmy G healthy, fired up possibly, while Trey Lance is providing this offense with just multiple high leverage traits that Jimmy G just doesn't. Trey Lance kind of allows Shanahan to incorporate heavy RPO looks, which would make the other Trey Sermon, feel right at home in an outside zone RPO heavy run game. And Trey Lance, he adds a vertical element to this offense that was completely non-existent last year and has been pretty much hard to come by during the entire Shanahan era with the 49ers. I might get into that when I talk about the available air yards here. And this is a point in time where if you I think San Francisco was at kind of a crossroads this offseason, and they chose correctly. If San Francisco is to be as impressive as they were 2 years ago, it won't be on the back of the defense this time. The offense will have to be the catalyst, you know what I mean? Their defense is just nowhere near as potent as even, you look at a team like the Rams in their own division, they're the team who could do that if you were going to make that argument. And the 49ers also, you speak of a team who lost their guy, like Robert Saleh was also lost to a head coaching gig, who I would argue played a much bigger part in the 49ers defensive success than Staley did in the Rams defensive success. Don't get me wrong. We still have decent, high hopes for this defense because of the strength of schedule. And it stems from that front seven that's still pretty mean, but the offense needs to do it. They need to do their part for them to be able to do it all. You know what I mean? So I don't think with all the going ons, I don't think even with the healthy George Kittle, we don't have to worry too much about this passing game because the weapons are in place. And I think even though people are worried that it might be a little bit more condensed offense, we'll wait and see if they try and acquire an N'Keal Harry or something like that. But I think the wide receiver position could actually see a lot more volume, a lot more work. We could see this look more like a typical Shanahan offense that we saw before San Francisco. And this would all be really good news for someone like Brandon Ayuk. George Kittle is going to get his, there's no doubt about it. But the wide receiver position kind of won big during this offseason. And if you look at last season, the wide receiver use can only increase with Lance on the horizon, I think. And again, I don't want to mislead. Kittle is still the number one. This offense will still be a run-first offense, which we'll get to momentarily. But the 49ers wide receivers last year, they ranked bottom 10 in targets, catches, and receiving yards. Per game, 49ers wide receivers combined for under 17.5 targets per game, under 12 catches per game, less than 150 yards. So pretty ugly stuff. But getting into available volume, I know that Kittle missed time. Deebo Samuel missed time. Again, so not the same as teams like the Rams necessarily, who have a lot of available volume and their best players still on the team who were there all year. But it's not totally dissimilar in San Francisco, especially when we expect a higher average depth of target and those two other guys being in more defined roles than Brandon Ayuk is. But we are going to see more deep passing in San Francisco. We're going to see more success off play action in San Francisco. So the Bay Area boys are top 10 in targets, air yards, and market share available. There's just under 200 total targets from 2020 up for grabs, about 35% of their total market share. So get the Ayuk concerns out of here. The splits were bad. He won't be the wide receiver 3 overall for a 9-week stretch again next year. Okay, I'll concede. Guy is still an incredible value where he's going in fantasy drafts. And we buy first round rookie wide receivers who produce going into year 2 anyways, no matter what. But the volume is the boring stuff. I'm telling you, like, it just shows that, like, the volume available might show that Kittle, Debo, Ayuk, and the running backs can all eat, right? But what we're really excited for is the air yards and the high leverage work. And there's already, deep passing work to be had, but we are also keeping in mind that there could be some additional sexy stuff going on that wasn't there last year. So over 35% of the air yards are up for grabs from last year, 1,335 total air yards. And I think Brandon Ayuk is the biggest massive winner in this situation. He only saw 12 deep ball targets last year per PFF.com. Deep ball targets, passes that traveled 20 plus yards in the air. 52 players saw more deep ball targets than Ayuk in 2020. But guys, Ayuk saw twice as many deep balls as any other 49er last season. As a rookie, he saw 30% of the 49ers deep balls last season. So what I'm trying to convey is actually how bad the quarterback play was in 2020 and how non-conducive it was. Like, Shanahan just did not dial up the deep ball, even off of play action. Like, to give you a taste here, remember, we saw 3 quarterbacks get in there for the 49ers in 2020. 3 of the 5 quarterbacks with the fewest deep ball attempts per game last year were those 3 49ers quarterbacks. It was so bad that those 3 also ranked bottom 10 in the past decade among all quarterbacks combined. And Shanny's scheme has done all the masking it can throughout the last 3 years. Like, they were getting to a boiling point. And, last year wasn't anomalous. It's been kind of a running theme in the Bay Area. 3 straight seasons now. A quarterback from the 49ers has had over 200 pass attempts, but under 6.8 average air yards per attempt. Over those 3 years, only a handful of other quarterbacks have accomplished that in all of football. It's crazy. 3 of the 8 quarterbacks are 49ers. So this has been one of the most boring, least conducive quarterback situations for a wide receiver to be tethered to. And then you add in the scheme that is very run heavy, right? But guys, almost 40% of the worst deep passing quarterbacks since 2018 have been quarterbacks. And now we're going to have a quarterback who is known for having a pretty strong arm coming into the picture at some point in Trey Lance. So, I mean, Kittle will accumulate air yards, but he is 100% a yards after the catch man, arguably the best ever in that facet of the game to ever play the tight end position. Deebo Samuel can increase his average depth of target. It would be literally impossible for him not to, since he is a wide receiver, not a running back. But I won't go down that rabbit hole. My point here, though, is that Brandon Ayuk is the weapon in this offense who is slated to win the most with any new wrinkles that are injected into this offense in 2020, along with, all the other boxes this guy checks. And another one of those gets me into my final topic with the 49ers wide receiver here, the red zone targets. Brandon Ayuk led the 49ers in red zone targets last year, and it wasn't even close. His 26 red zone targets were 11 more than Kendrick Bourne, who is now in New England. What really made me double take was seeing that under 10% of both George Kittle and Deebo Samuel's targets when healthy came inside the opponent's red zone in 2020. Compare that to about 30% for Brandon Ayuk. And just to pause there and marvel that this 21-year-old rookie last season saw about 30% of his targets in the red zone, and about 30% of his targets also traveled 20 plus yards in the air. Both figures dominated the team last year. That's crazy. And since I'm buried in this PFF data here, let's zoom in even closer and see that Ayuk led the team by a mile in end zone targets and end zone market share. Wow. So Ayuk led the team in end zone targets, followed by Kendrick Bourne and Jordan Reed. Those 3 combined for 16 end zone targets. The rest of the team combined, including Kittle and Deebo, had 7. And why I bring up the red zone and end zone data is because the available volume is abundant. The 49ers have 13 targets inside the 10-yard line from last year, up for grabs. That's the 4th most in football. But talking about those market shares, it's just under 36% of their 10-zone market share. And I think the play volume, the success rates, everything in this offense stands to increase. And that can all compensate for any dip in pass rate. Like even if they become a little bit more run heavy in the red zone with Trey Lance in the mix, because we do have to account for him calling his own number at the goal line for Trey Lance. And that gets us into, I guess, the rushing work that's up for grabs, because there's some turnover at the running back position. I hinted at it, but Trey Sermon coming in is the biggest, right? But both Treys do need to be accounted for, because what percent of the 49ers carries do we need to attribute to Trey Lance? That's why it's annoying that we don't know if he's going to be in there week 1. Is that number 15%? Is it 20%? Is it more? Because there will be a ton of rushing work in this offense, spread around. The 49ers have been in 3 wide receiver sets well under 50% of the time in back-to-back seasons. So they just look like, the outside zone scheme that teams like the Packers and Titans have gone about trying to replicate, right? And even beyond Trey Lance, we have to determine, what does this running back by committee look like? I see it as a backfield Trey Sermon could capture, though. I'm going to give my hot take off the top, which we have seen in several Shanahan offenses. Most recently, that running back was Carlos Hyde in San Francisco. And if you look at the running back position as a whole, you kind of start to salivate in San Francisco, right? Even if we know that Trey Lance, the quarterback, will cut into this work, but in 2020, the 49ers combined to finish top 10 in every conceivable category. 6th in carries, 8th in rushing yards. Running backs were 5th in rushing touchdowns. 7th in catches. Running backs in San Francisco combined for the 5th most running back receptions last year. 1st in receiving touchdowns. Running backs in San Fran averaged over 30 touches per game. 5th most. They scored over 30 fantasy points per game in PPR, the 3rd most. And turning our attention to Trey Sermon in. McKinnon, Coleman, out. There's available volume, right? The 49ers have 177 touches up for grabs at the running back position, just under 30% of their carries from a season ago, about 20% of their goal line market share. 52 vacated running back targets are available. That's the 5th most. So I am absolutely smashing both rookies named Trey, and I might be the highest person on Brendan Ayuk to get out of the 49ers here, but I really can't stress how high I am on all these players in San Francisco. It's kind of crazy. And I might be one of the highest, or, at least up there with some of these Seattle Seahawks players over the last few years combined. Be it Russ, be it DK, be it Tyler Lockett, or Chris Carson. So let's get into the favorite team of the majority of my good buddies, because I am up here in the Pacific Northwest. The Seahawks are another team with work up for grabs, another team who allots a lot of advantages to the wide receiver position as well, and their core is still intact. Just thinking about this core of players on offense and sort of the one hang up that exists, right? Which is the identity of this offense, Pete fucking Carroll. But I do want to point out that DK Metcalf has curved the offense a little bit, and it coincided with a diminished role from the tight end position in Seattle. So the Seahawks have been basically an elite situation for the wide receivers over the last 2 years. They scored the 6th most PPR points last year, despite ranking 12th in receptions, 7th most PPR points as a wide receiver position in 2019, despite 15th in receptions. And the uptick again is because guys like Doug Baldwin and Jimmy Graham have now been replaced by DK, Tyler Lockett. And in 2018, you see Seattle scored the 17th most PPR points by a wide receiver. So we see that big jump up that we've seen. And they were 27th in reception. So we see the key to the efficiency for this offense kind of showing up there. What leads to those fantasy points is the efficiency that it's kind of unparalleled when it comes to Russell Wilson's efficiency. When we get into the available volume, though, I think thing to consider, number one, a lot of this is tight end targets. That's gone, and they brought in Gerald Everett, right? So the vacated volume, it looks enticing, but it does come from a multitude of guys as well. So it's possible it just gets redistributed amongst all the ancillary pieces, because last year DK and Lockett saw about half the team's targets, which is crazy. And it's hard to see that go too much higher is what I'm saying. You don't see a lot of teams heaping 55 to 60% of targets on 2 guys. So we would need at that point the play volume to go up or the pass attempts to go up. But I wouldn't bank on that. The Seahawks have thrown the ball under 575 times in 11 straight seasons, the longest active streak in football. Titans are the only other team even remotely close. And if you were curious, 11 years is in fact how many years Pete Carroll has been the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Even if you you can look at the fewest pass attempts among all 320 teams combined over the last 5 years. 3 of the 5 lowest pass attempt totals belong to Seattle. And it's kind of funny because we can almost look at the totals in this offense a lot easier than we can in other offenses. We're not as laser focused and fixated on the market share. So 144 total targets up for grabs, just over 1/4 of their market share from a season ago, just under 1/4 of their air yards from 2020 left during the offseason, about 1,000 total. And really quick, I mentioned Lockett and DK. They combined for about half the team's targets. Pretty crazy. They had almost 3,000 combined air yards, about 60% of the team's market share, which is insane. And guys, not all air yards are created equal, right? Like there's a spectrum from prayer yards to slayer yards, right? And there's no quarterback in football who's better at converting their air yards than Russell Wilson. Actually, only Russell Wilson and Matt Ryan have over 2,400 completed air yards in back-to-back seasons, and Matt Ryan has almost 200 more pass attempts in that span. And so what I'm saying is this is mostly Russ, but as we slide into the good stuff here, we start to see this insane efficiency paying off for DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So we have to give those two some credit as well. Last year, for example, DK and Tyler Lockett were the only wide receiver teammates, both top 15 in completed air yards. And if that wasn't enough, both dudes ranked top 10 in end zone targets and end zone touchdowns among wide receivers. So this passing game is like an unbelievable marriage, menage a trois of skill sets here. And, they're checking all the boxes that we are chasing. You know what I mean? The Seahawks duo are just they're elite in both territories when it comes to the high leverage work, right? Like it's crazy, the ultra high leverage work, when basically no other teammates are both in either categories together. So it's crazy. And they're doing all of this in a relatively low volume passing game. It's just remarkable to put that into context. And why I got into or hinted at the end zone stuff is because the available volume, just over 1/4 of the targets are gone, just under 1/4 of the air yards. Almost 40% of the Seahawks market share from inside the 10-yard line is gone from 2020. Their 16 vacated targets inside the 10-yard line is the most in football, 1 per game, from Russell Wilson, who post-NFL merger has the 3rd best touchdown rate ever at 6.2%. In 7 seasons with a 6+% touchdown rate, ranks 2nd in NFL history. And Breeze holds that record with just 1 more season than Russ, who sits ahead of Favre and Peyton with 6 of those seasons. Brady and Rodgers with 5. So he has eyes for that record. But getting back to the matter at hand, the touchdown upside for DK, for Tyler Lockett, and pretty much everybody else in this offense is kind of hard to quantify. It is off the charts, off the Richter, and in my opinion, not being baked into the ADPs in fantasy drafts enough. Because I was talking about end zone targets, and we talked about the close to or more than 50% monopoly that DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett had on every facet of this passing game. And that extends to end zone targets and end zone touchdowns. No doubt about it. It extends to total touchdowns in this offense, actually, receiving touchdowns. But DK and Lockett combined for 30 end zone targets last year, according to PFF, which dwarfs most teams. And behind them, guys, the next 3 most targeted Seahawks in the end zone from 2020 are all gone. They leave behind 20 end zone targets and 10 end zone touchdowns. 10 end zone touchdowns is 4 more than the Patriots had as a team last year. The Jets had just 8 end zone receiving touchdowns per PFF. The Giants, too. Not sure what happened in the Big Apple there. Well, we're pretty sure. But DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett combined for 25% more touchdowns in the end zone last year than all Patriots and Jets combined. The same amount as the 2 New York teams combined. Or, to put it another way, New England and the Jets combined to score 2 more touchdowns in the end zone in 2020 than the Seattle Seahawks have vacated from last season. And this isn't really me just picking on a couple teams here either. I'm trying to relay how incredible the Seahawks are in this area of the field. We talked about the 49ers' ability to bounce back in major categories in the passing game. Throwing the ball into the end zone is a great place to start. They had just 9 end zone touchdown receptions in 2020, less than Greg Olsen, Hollister, and David Moore combined. The Bengals had just 9 end zoners despite almost 40 attempts into the end zone. Washington had 11. So did the Broncos. So come on. People say you can't chase touchdowns, but Seattle is 100% an exception. In fact, Russell Wilson has basically led the NFL in end zone touchdown passes in 4 straight seasons, according to PFF. I say basically because in 2018, he actually did finish second, but that's behind Andrew Luck. And last year, I should have mentioned that I am using data here that isn't very repeatable. I should have mentioned that his end zone touchdowns will probably come down by half a dozen or so. Russ having 30 end zone touchdown passes it's record-setting stuff. It's the most in the PFF era for like as long as they had data available. And it was 4 more end zone touchdown passes than Peyton Manning had in his touchdown record-setting 2013 season. But a lot of this conversation comes back to efficiency versus volume, right? And then the scale, like how far does that scale tip, on one side or the other? Because I do want to get out of here, and there's no doubt that I have laid it on hard for the Seahawks passing game, but some folks might still be scared off for 2 reasons, right? Number one, the crazy second half splits. In 2020, weeks 1 to 8, Russ was the quarterback 1 overall. He was record-setting pace, MVP candidate. From weeks 9 on, Russ wasn't even a top 10 quarterback in fantasy last year. In 2019, he was the quarterback 2 overall after 8 weeks. Was the MVP Lamar Jackson? Was it Russell Wilson? Who knows? From weeks 9 on, from that point on, Russ was the quarterback 14 for fantasy owners. And these splits hit even harder during your fantasy football playoffs. And, the worry is that it had a lot to do with defenses and teams adjusting to them, right? Defending against that deep pass. And that's pretty much the second reason there's still some healthy skepticism when it comes to the Seahawks, the passing game, talking about some of the stats I'm talking about, is the volume, right? And the signals sent by Pete Carroll during the offseason that they aren't going to be a run-heavy team. I won't get into the lover spat between Russ and the club, but we remember the list, and we were kind of on your side anyways, dude. So, how does the let Russ cook thing play out in 2021? I think, like I said off the top, they ain't throwing more than 575 times, right? But with DK and Lockett blossoming, we've seen a concerted effort, and we've seen the efficiency continue to spike alongside the high leverage work, the air yards, the touchdowns, the smoke signals I was referring to there beyond the lover's quarrel. Was the Seahawks and Schottenheimer also broke up. And it sounded like Seattle parted ways with their 2020 offensive coordinator over philosophical differences. And, they replaced him with division rival Shane Waldron, who comes from the Rams off the McVay tree. And the Rams have not been known for their deep passing, right? Over the last couple of years, their deep passing has been completely infamous. Plus, it's a hard pill to swallow because we knew whoever took over the offensive coordinator position in Seattle is agreeing to stay in the confines of an offense that Pete Carroll approves of, as antiquated and annoying as that might be to us passing game aficionados. So Waldron likely does take that job without, he doesn't take that job without agreeing to run the damn ball. Shout out to Jacob Sanderson. So I concede to all those points, guys, including the second half splits and all that. But I could argue for a few things here to balance those worries out, maybe. Starting with the reports out of camp that Seattle and Russ are attempting a lot more short passes, quick releases, which can do multiple things. It can combat against their much maligned offensive line. It can also help expand DK Metcalf's route tree, if you will, or his versatility. And he did average over 5 yards after the catch per reception last year. And with Shane Waldron coming from the Rams off that McVay tree, we hope he brings with him some play action. Russ has been under 30% play action in back-to-back seasons. I expect him to get over that threshold in 2021, which can build in extra efficiency, especially deep passing efficiency. More play action also might mean more RPOs, which, a lot of this, my whole point, hopefully I want some more motion as well coming from this Ram system, because what we need is them to disguise their looks more. That's the whole point, which I think if they can do a better job disguising their looks, that can quell some concerns about teams, quote, fighting them out, like, figuring them out, finding them out halfway through the year, which is obviously a big oversimplification, I think. But a lot of that, I won't argue, is predicated on some of the run game, right? And that would be my kind of biggest bugaboo, and definitely my biggest problem with the identity that this offense persists to put forth. Like, I love Chris Carson, including in 2021 for fantasy at cost, but you have an unequivocal elite signal caller in Russell Wilson. You have DK Metcalf, you have Tyler Lockett. For fantasy, by the way, I think, like, Russ is a great value. I have him and Herbert in that tier after Josh Allen, Kyler, Dak, Lamar, all those guys. But I won't be surprised if he scores alongside them. Russ is one of the rare quarterbacks who have a quarterback one overall season in their range of outcomes. Russ also has a quarterback one overall fantasy season on his resume as well. I think DK Metcalf is a no do to boot it top 10 wide receiver in 2021, closer to top 5 for me. And I think Tyler Lockett is a clear cut wide receiver 2 for me. Both guys are targets. I am trying to even go out of my way to stack this offense in Seattle. The Rams we talked about, the Cowboys might be another one. There's not a lot of teams that I'm looking to do that with, but the Seahawks are one of them. I think there's also some league winning potential here before I get back into the running back. Seattle is one of the best playoff strength of schedules, including the Lions in fantasy playoff championship week. So don't let those splits get too into your head. And with that on the mind, let's zoom through the running backs here, the available volume here, and then I'm out. Because I didn't want this to be this long. I cannot believe I went this long on one division, but I got the first one out of the way and I can be more concise going forward, right? So Chris Carson, man, is he a bargain in fantasy drafts, or it sure feels like that. He's such an underrated running back in terms of being one of the most elusive running backs in football. Only guys like Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb have been definitively harder to bring down since this guy broke onto the scene. The broken tackles and yards after contact prove that point. So the guy is talented and he's in a really good spot, which is, exponentially more important for a running back, of course. And that's caused a pretty good confluence of events, right? For fantasy owners, like over the last 3 seasons combined, Chris Carson is the running back 12 in total PPR points, scoring about 15 points per game. Coincidentally, 15 is the average between his RB 17 finish in 2020 overall in PPR and his RB 13 finish in points per game, which is kind of him in a nutshell. Drafted as like a mid to late RB2, considered like a mid RB2, but scores closer to RB1 status. A lot was made about Carlos Hyde stealing work from him, but what was lost besides Carlos Hyde this offseason is that in 2020, Chris Carson actually set a career high in catches, which was really encouraging. So we aren't certain exactly who is the third option in the passing game behind the dynamic duo at wide receiver. It could be Gerald Everett, maybe it's Wayne Eskridge, but I'd bet it's the running back position in Seattle, right? So that is definitely something that gives us some encouragement for Chris Carson. And just before I forget, the Seattle Seahawks have about 100 available carries, just under a quarter of the rushing market share from a season ago is up for grabs, 115 total running back touches, which is the Mendoza line at 16th overall. About 22% of the goal line carries up for grabs. The questions we're asking, I guess, or why we're getting a discount on Chris Carson still is Rashad Penny might finally be healthy, right? A former first-round pick who has flashed when on the field. There's also a possibility that Seattle brings a running back in still, or defines a role for DJ Dallas or Travis Homer as a third down back. That's my big concern with Chris Carson. And it cropped up because they were in on Gio Bernard, who eventually signed with the Buccaneers, of course. But at cost, there's no way Chris Carson isn't a value right now. Still, the passing game is what we should be attacking in Seattle. And the concerns in that facet of the Seahawks offense are just so much less worrisome to me. But there's going to just be a ton of fantasy goodness produced by this unit, by this whole division. Maybe that's why it took so damn long here. And I just think some of the best values, some of the highest ownerships should come from the Seahawks, from the Rams, the 49ers, and the Cardinals. So I will fly away now. Thanks so much for listening, for watching, for downloading, for subscribing and reviewing. Please and thank you. And thank you to Monkey Knife Fight, fantasypoints.com, Fantasy Points Media Group. I cannot thank you enough. And persons who use our promo code 21TrueNorth10, all caps, to get a discount at fantasypoints.com. I can't thank you enough, for real. Follow the pod at TNFF Pod, at True North FFB is where all the crew is at. I'm at TNFF Tyrell. And until next time, draft NFC West.